examples of one thing. So everything from a paramecium to an elephant to a butterfly to a redwood tree to us is unified by a single genetic code. We are essentially one thing. And that is extraordinary because we're asking in astronomy, what if life is different in its basis? And yet the one basis we have here produces fantastic diversity. All the appearances, the differences of appearance that, the racial issues that reft our culture, cause rifts between us, are essentially trivial. All of the morphological differences of human skin color, facial color, hair, and so on amount to a handful of genes amongst the 25,000 genes. The best way to put that is to say that if I plucked any two people on the planet from, say, a Inuit and a Bantu herdsman, the difference in their DNA is likely to be a couple of times larger than the difference in DNA between you and one of your non-related neighbors in the town you were born. So there is a unity here. It's the unity of biology. It's the unity shown by the sequencing now, not the traditional way based on morphology, the Darwinian way. It's the definition based on the gradual deviation from a last common ancestor 4 billion years ago. And so, not perhaps with the monks, but in my work as an astronomer, I've tried to imagine how different life might be, how weird it might be. And it can be weird at different scales. On the micro scale, you could just have different amino acids. The selectivity of life is that it uses a set of under 24 from 100,000 possible amino acids. So you could have different amino acids, you could have different bases for a nucleic acid, for a replicating molecule. You could go a little weirder and avoid the central dogma, as it's called by biologists with tongue-in-cheek, the DNA, RNA, protein triad. You could go away from carbon as the replicating molecule and go away from water as the solvent because other ingredients exist. They're maybe not optimal, but life is not optimal. This biology is not the best of all possible solutions. It's a very good solution. And then you could go very weird because as amazing as biology is, the fact that the information content of the human genome in a single human cell could actually be exceeded by several orders of magnitude by different arrangements of those chemical ingredients. So life is not as compact as it could be in a genetic information sense. So you can imagine much denser and more highly concentrated biological bases, and because evolution and changes tend to scale with size, that could lead to evolutionary rates that are orders of magnitude faster. Going up to the macroscopic level, again, there's a lot of possibilities. We have cells with and without nuclei. The human body is composed of about 50 different cells. You could have a large number of different cell types. You could have evolution that didn't go in the gradual mutation of DNA or RNA, but involved a bazaar where genetic material was swapped in larger packages, as we think happened early in the history of life, and still happens. Gene swapping, organism swapping, again, accelerates evolution, creates new possibilities. And then we're kind of cell-centric. The cell is the container. But you could do everything that biology does by avoiding cells and having networks, chemical networks as opposed to containers. Or the container might be the pore space of rocks rather than a membrane. And then finally, based on quorum sensing in bacteria and evolutionary strategies we've seen in the microbial kingdom, you could easily imagine scaling that up to such that the kings of a planet and the queens of a planet need not be large creatures with the power to manipulate nature and technology, but they could be microbial creatures that have developed geoengineering, that have developed planetary scale adaptation of their environment. So we moved into, with the monks again, we moved into hypothetical genetics as well. So having done physics and chemistry, we moved into biology. This is the genetics we know, the strong rule base pairing, Watson-Crick pairing. But Zoob suggests other possibilities, because if you just use Zoob and make your own genetic code, you can actually code more information. The genetic code has obviously a significant amount of redundancy. It has to do error checking. It has to be reliable. But the trade-off between information content, reliability, robustness, and speed of transcription, that's a trade-off. And you could make that trade-off in different ways. So we experimented with other hypothetical genetic codes using Zoob as our example. And then, of course, there's the issue of emergence. I was trained as a physicist, but I'm not a reductionist. And so I recognize that in many aspects of my field and other scientific fields, you have emergent properties. For example, in the theories of physics, particles, subatomic individual particles have volume, mass, charge, and spin, but they are now presumed to be composed of individual entities called strings or superstrings that have none of those properties. All of those properties are emergent. Water is perhaps a better example. Water is clear, wet, it's a solvent, and in a sort of polarization sense or orientation sense, it's polar. But a single water molecule is clearly not wet. How could it be transparent? And it's not a solvent. So at what point do water molecules turn into water? Bacteria can adapt, reproduce, store information, process energy, but the proteins, the individual information units of which it's composed, can do none of these things. And then brains, of course, that can be think and think of their own death, are composed of chemical and electrical networks whose component parts cannot do those things. The other thing I used from the tradition I was embedded in was I liked the idea of what you could do with grains of sand, because you can take them in every direction. Like I said, the Greek philosophers Democritus made the first speculation on atoms based on the hypothetical experiment of cutting a grain of sand over and over again with a sharp knife. And we know that seen through a microscope, there are beautiful little geological and biological worlds in grains of sand that our eyes are just not good enough to see. So to get the monks familiar with the sense of numbers, because they were not familiar with large numbers, I asked them each what was the largest number that they not just knew of to speak to me, but the largest number they felt in their solar plexus, they experienced. And the way we got to that was by estimating the number of grains of sand in a sand mandala. It turns out to be about 1 billion, and that's a good number. And so we got to sort of experiential understanding of billion, at least in the solar plexus sense. And as we go into the mandala, we eventually will get down to that level that Democritus imagined but couldn't quite realize with the technology available to him. And sand is complex. The complexity we see around us, leads many people to posit an intelligent designer or creative force that must have produced such wonder and complexity. But the natural processes that act over vast amounts of time, I think it's not the complexity that stumbles us in our intuition. I think it's the time that stumbles us, because to the age of the universe, our lifetimes are the blink of an eye if the age of the universe was a year. We really cannot accommodate the timescales over which evolution has created living creatures and then evolved them into diverse forms. And the descriptions are not easy, too. Even the simple description of a growing pile of sand requires and needs complex but quite beautiful mathematics. So to continue on upward to the big scale with the grains of sand, I'll give you the astronomer's best guess in advance of finding life elsewhere of what awaits us out there in the universe. The number of extrasolar planets yet discovered, first one in 1995, finding planets beyond the solar system, it's new. It's brilliant new science. About 400, maybe the number of grains that would stick to a wet finger, 400. If Earth's perfect Earth clones, don't even look for a strange place and strange life, just ask for the perfect place where life could start. Say they're only 1 in a million or so, you might have a few in a handful of sand, a few Earths among all the stars. So now each grain of sand is a star. The number of stars in the galaxy, the Milky Way, is about the number of grains of sand in this sand pit. Now, I should say that the best theories of star formation predict there will be terrestrial planets, habitable worlds in every solar system. In the Milky Way, there are probably a dozen worlds, mostly moons of the giant planets, that have the 3 ingredients necessary for life, which is organic material, liquid water, and energy. And Enceladus, a tiny little moon of Saturn, surprised every astronomer when it was found to have geysers and all of those 3 ingredients. It's a 500-kilometer sized body. Nobody thought a small moon like that could have the ingredients for life. So basically what I'm saying is that the best estimate of astronomers is that every grain of sand in this sand pit, every star in this galaxy is likely to have at least one habitable world. Now, that might not be an Earth-like world, a perfect world, but it's going to be a place where life could evolve, and there's plenty of time for it to do so. But this is just one galaxy. There are 50 billion galaxies, and that's not very well represented, but roughly represented by the entire stretch of beach. So what I'm saying now is that every one of those grains of sand is a place where life could be. I mentioned it's useful to be able to intuit large numbers. So the number of sand grains in the mandala is about 1 billion. And 1 billion is about the number of possibly Earth-like habitable worlds in the Milky Way. The little travelogue you saw, 5 seconds per planet inspected in some other solar system, if we could make a picture of it, to map that little travelogue into the number of habitable worlds in just the Milky Way galaxy, it would last 20,000 years. So you get a sense of what's out there. And what are the possibilities of those billion habitable worlds in our galaxy, trillions in the universe? Well, the universe has been able to make Earth-like planets for billions of years before the Milky Way even formed. So time is the other relevant dimension. And although we tend to think of ourselves like this, it's hard for us to resist thinking that we're special, we should bear in mind that there's time for life to have got started on Earth-like worlds billions of years before the Earth started. And so there are almost certainly creatures out there that are as to us as we are to bacteria. And that leads to some slightly less comfortable possibilities. So we, again, really need to get over ourselves because what's out there is a little hard to imagine. So I want to wrap up and give a little sense, a little flavor of what it was like to be out there in northern India. This was my group. And I'm a physical scientist, but I was doing astrobiology, so I had to wear a lab coat because otherwise I don't get to wear a lab coat. There was a lot of fun. We had an awful lot of fun. There was a lot of joy there. There's a story behind this. I don't have time to give it, but Paul was so good at the end that he was doing Zoob with his feet. So, and I couldn't keep up with him making stuff. I don't know if anyone's going to try that this evening.